She's co-author of Touchstone and Viewpoint, and spent 9 years in Japan setting up English programs and teaching in Japanese senior high schools and vocational colleges. She's conducted training seminars for English teachers throughout East Asia. Over to you, Helen.
Good morning, everybody. From here I am based in Park City in Utah. First of all, thank you so much for joining the webinar. I realize for many of you it's actually late afternoon or even evening by now. So thank you for making time to join us. Today's webinar is called What Good Teaching Materials Should Do, Vocabulary. So today the focus is going to be on vocabulary and some of the things that you can look for when you're looking to teach vocabulary in your classroom. What good teaching materials should do when it comes to vocabulary. When I was teaching in Asia, my students were always so concerned about grammar, and so much so that it often paralyzed them. And they couldn't speak because they were so afraid of making grammatical errors. And at that time, I found this quote, and it was a great reminder to me as a teacher about how important vocabulary is in teaching a language. And here's the quote: "Without grammar, very little can be conveyed. Without vocabulary, nothing can be conveyed." And of course, it seems fairly obvious to say that teaching vocabulary is important. But in many of the classes I've observed around the world, vocabulary often gets less focus in the classroom. And that's often typically because most class time is used in explaining grammar, doing grammar practice activities, doing face-to-face conversation tasks, listening tasks, all of these things that take classroom time. And often when new vocabulary rears its head, oftentimes the teacher or another student simply explains the new vocabulary, students write down the new word, and somehow students are expected to sort of magically retain that new vocabulary. But teaching vocabulary is without a doubt a huge challenge. And one of the challenges is simply the sheer volume of vocabulary that we could teach. It's absolutely enormous. And if you think about it, some dictionaries have a vocabulary of more than 54,000 word families. And that number doesn't even include other forms of a base word or derivatives or foreign words that have entered the English language. That's just the core word family. And it's such a huge number, and it's way well beyond what we can even expect native speakers to use. And of course, a great deal of research has been done to try and establish the size of a native speaker vocabulary. And a generally accepted estimate is that a university graduate will have a vocabulary of around 20,000 word families. And you can read some of this in the literature, for example, with Golden, Nation and Reed in their papers from 1990. But getting our students to a native speaker level of vocabulary is not at all easy. And look at these statistics on the slide in front of you. So, for example, if a student learns 2,000 words of vocabulary in English, we can expect that the student will be able to read about 80% of a text. That means 80% sounds a lot, but still that means that 1 in every 5 words will be unknown to the student. It's a ratio that's so high that students are not likely to be able to guess those unknown words. So even with 2,000 words, it's still very difficult to understand a written text. And there's research by Lunar and Nation on that from 1985. The statistics I've presented here are from Francis and Pachira in 1982. And you'll see that When students know a vocabulary of 3,000 words, they can understand about 84% of the text. And with 4,000 words, about 86.8, 87% of the text. So with each new 1,000 words that students learn, there's a small incremental gain in what students can understand. The situation is a little bit more encouraging when it comes to spoken language. Research done by my co-author, Professor Michael McCarthy, shows that if a student learns about 1,800 words in spoken language, that represents about 80% of a spoken corpus. So it's really clear, first of all, that there is a huge volume of vocabulary, and we need to get our beginner students to a point pretty quickly where they have at least a 2,000 to 3,000 word vocabulary. But that's not enough, and we have to keep pushing students to acquire more and more vocabulary. So the question is, how do we get students to learn more vocabulary? Well, one way that's proven is for students to immerse themselves in the language and go on an overseas trip, get themselves to an English-speaking country and study abroad for a year. Great way to learn vocabulary, works very effectively, but it's not entirely practical. We can't simply opt mid-term and move our classes to California. That would be lovely, but it's not practical. So another way to get students to learn more vocabulary is to have them read in more specialized subject areas. It can be in any area of interest that students have. And if they read in these special interest areas, they will certainly expand their vocabulary. And again, there's research to support that. Another approach is, rather than just work on getting students to know more vocabulary, we should get them to find out more about the words that they already know. And this is the range versus depth argument that you can read about in the literature. So what does that mean exactly, to find out more about an item of vocabulary? What kinds of things can we teach about a word? Well, here are some examples and some ideas on the slide in front of you. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it will give you some ideas about what we can teach about the depth of an item of vocabulary. So first of all, we can obviously teach the meaning of an item. Most words in English language have multiple meanings. They have various meanings. If we take the example hot, it means a hot temperature. You can have a hot temperature. It was hot today. It's by no means hot in Salt Lake City, Utah, here where I am. We had a foot of snow last night. Hot can also mean spicy hot, like jalapeno peppers are hot. They certainly are to me. Or if you're a fan of the band One Direction, you might think that Harry Styles is hot. My teenage daughter certainly thinks so. And all I hear about is how hot Harry Styles is. And it means attractive and appealing. Hot can mean goods that are stolen. It can be used to describe someone who is hot-tempered, they're with a quick temper. And so you can see that a simple word like hot, that students may already know at a very basic level, can have a multitude of meanings. We can also find out about a word's spoken and written forms. For example, yeah versus yes. Yeah is typically the spoken form. Yes, you would certainly use in writing rather than yeah. Yes is more formal, yeah, more informal. We can find out if a word has any suffixes or prefixes. For example, literate or illiterate, or attain and attainment, where ment is the suffix. We can find out about a word's grammatical behaviour. For example, we have the adjective patient, and we know we can make that into an adverb, patiently. We can find out the associations of a word. For example, does it have any opposite or similar meanings? We can find out what connotations a word has. And an example here would be the word precocious. Precocious means a child who's ahead of his or her years and has developed sort of certain abilities at an earlier age than usual. And in British English, precocious has a slightly negative connotation. But in American English, it doesn't carry a negative connotation at all. And parents proudly proclaim that their child is precocious. We can teach students about a word's frequency in the language. Is it frequently used or not? So there are many things that we can learn about any given word. And as I said, this particular list is by no means exhaustive. So let's think about what good teaching material should do. Well, one good thing that material should do is teach more about vocabulary. It's important that you choose materials that help with teaching the depth of a vocabulary, that can encourage students to learn all there is to know about a word, not just a range of vocabulary. So when you're selecting your materials for the classroom, make sure that your materials have activities that help students understand all there is to know about a word. And here's an example. This is from a high intermediate level. And you'll see the learning tip is about specialized vocabulary. And it says when you learn vocabulary from a specific area, and in this case it's about animal behavior, find out if it has other uses in general English or in idioms. And we'll see the example, hibernate. Animals hibernate or sleep in the winter, and computers hibernate when they're running but they're not being used. So two very different meanings, and we can't necessarily expect students to know those meanings intuitively. They have to be taught these meanings. So look for materials that help you to do that. Or as here, find materials that actively teach more formal and less formal expressions. And this is useful and can be done even at lower levels. This is a beginner level exercise. And you'll see the more formal and less formal expressions. Yes, more formal. Yes, less formal. Thank you. Thanks. Hello. Hi. How are you? How are you doing? So these are very useful even for students at a beginner level. And look for materials that can show you the difference between written vocabulary and spoken vocabulary. For example, the word nevertheless here, again, this is a higher level. And you can see from this chart that it's used much more frequently in writing than in conversation. Doesn't mean it's not used in conversation, but nevertheless is a vocabulary item that is used frequently in writing. And you certainly want to look for materials that overtly teach suffixes and prefixes. This is an extremely useful way for students to make some gains quite quickly in vocabulary. Here, the activity overtly practices suffixes, and you'll see a study tip about why learning suffixes is important. And here students are learning suffixes like al or ical, ICAL for adjectives, and shun for nouns. And in reading, suffixes can help you understand new words. And in writing, using different word forms helps you avoid repetition. And that's really important for students, especially those that want to improve their test scores. Avoiding repetition of words can help improve test scores. So let's look at this activity very quickly. This is a summary of an article, and it says complete the second sentences with a form of the bold words in the first sentences. The words can all be found in the article. The article was presented prior to this activity. So let's try and do the first two items. Technology companies love to innovate and hope that consumers will adopt their products quickly. However, consumers vary in their approach to, and there you will see the word innovate used with the suffix tion, shun. So consumers vary in their approach to innovation, and the missing word is adoption of new technology. Try the second item. Consumers used to be more cautious. Their caution was due to the high price of gadgets, etc. And let's give just one more example of the kinds of things to look for in your teaching materials. Here, students are taught how to use opposite meanings to build their vocabulary. And there's a note also about prefixes. You'll see that adjectives without prefixes, such as happy, unhappy, honest, dishonest, are much more frequent in conversation. And the actual learning tip is about opposite meanings. When you learn a new word, find out if it has an opposite. Be careful, sometimes the word has different meanings and different opposites. So for example, this exercise is hard. This exercise is easy, would be the opposite. He's a hard worker. He's lazy, he doesn't work hard. This chair feels hard. This chair feels soft. So the same word can often have different opposites. So what's important is that your textbook materials or other materials that you are using actively teach students how to learn more about any given word. Well, getting students to learn more about vocabulary items they learn is one thing, but it's quite another determining what vocabulary to teach in the first place. Obviously, we can't teach every word there is, so we have to be selective in the words we teach our students. But where do we start? We need to teach useful vocabulary, but what exactly is useful vocabulary? Oftentimes, we see teachers focus beginner vocabulary on various semantic sets. For example, closed semantic sets like days of the week, months of the year, and more open semantic sets like colors or items of clothing, where there's a vast range of items. And clearly, students need to know this basic vocabulary, this sort of topical vocabulary. But all textbooks and materials are not the same in how they teach this vocabulary. What good teaching materials could usefully do is present and teach the most useful items in these kinds of semantic sets or these topical sets. So when you're looking for good teaching materials, look for materials that have been developed and informed by a good corpus, because that way you can be sure that the items of vocabulary you are teaching are the most frequent items in language. And this can be really useful, and let me give you an example. Obviously, all textbooks are going to teach the months of the year. And no textbook material is going to say, well, February is the month that people talk about least. It's not that frequent in conversation, so we won't bother teaching the word February. You can just imagine a class where we're standing there saying, okay, repeat after me, January, March, April, May, and we don't teach February. Not going to happen. However, when it comes to very open semantic sets like colors, how useful it is to know that the 10 colors that you can teach in class, that you have time to teach, are the most frequently used colors in the language. That can be very helpful. We can't teach every color there is, but at least at beginner levels, we can start by teaching the most frequent items. In this instance, it's the most frequent colors that we use in conversation. And you'll see those colors presented here: white, black, red, blue, brown, green, yellow, grey, pink, and orange. Those are the 10 colors we talk about most. So why not teach those first? And here's a fun little activity that you can use when you're teaching these kinds of sets of vocabulary items with students. Imagine for a moment we're teaching genres of music. We want our students to know the word rock, classical, rap, those kinds of vocabulary items. Well, many teachers in good teaching practice, before they teach a set of vocabulary, do have students call out the words that students already know. Great way to activate the vocabulary, write them on the board. But try this slight twist to the activity. Before you have students call out an item from a set, have them write down one item. So here, one genre of music. But tell the students they must write something that they don't think other students will write. So remember, you don't want the students to write the same as everyone else. Then have students call out the items. You'll certainly activate a wider range of vocabulary from the students, and it makes it a really fun challenge for students. So what I want to try and show you here is that the kinds of things we already do in class, we can put a slight twist on it and make it a little bit more of a challenge, a little bit more fun, a little bit more interesting. Or tell students, we're going to learn colors today. Can you guess the top 5 colors that we use in English? It's another great way to activate vocabulary from students, and they have a lot of fun doing this activity. And then you can show them the in conversation panel that tells you the top 10 colors that people talk about. Okay, so we know our materials need to teach frequently used vocabulary, but what other vocabulary do we need to teach? Well, teaching collocations is certainly a great way to help students achieve some gains in their knowledge of vocabulary. Again, if you're interested in the teaching of collocations and some of the research behind it, you can go to Google Scholar and search the word collocation, and you can pull up some excellent articles, a huge range of literature surrounding the teaching of collocations. But very simply put, a collocation can be simply defined as words that go together, words that keep company with each other. And it's very useful to teach our students collocations. So for example, we tend to talk about flash floods. We get a lot of those in Utah, in our dry desert areas. We get a little bit of rain, and we can get a lot of flash floods through the canyons. We have flash floods, not quick floods. And typically, we talk about tall trees, not high trees. And here you'll see a great picture. We have an example of a very tall tree. It's a Californian redwood. It's a tall tree, not a high tree. I'm the one in the middle, so you do have a picture of me right there. To the right is my nephew, who is also very tall. He's tall, he's not high, thankfully. Here's a simple activity that you can use with your students to help them grasp different collocates of different words. And let's take the word heavy. So I'd like you to try this activity. Have a look at the collocates of heavy and see if you can guess the word that we can't use with heavy. We have heavy person, heavy rain, heavy movie, heavy meal, heavy workload, a heavy sleeper, a heavy smoker, and a heavy accent. So, can you guess the one word that we can't use with heavy? By the way, for this activity, you can create collocations like this to give your students, or you can have students create a set like this and present them to a partner, for a partner to look at. Okay, so which word? Any idea? The odd one out? Actually, it's a trick. I'm feeling very tricky today. You can actually use all of these words with heavy. They are all collocates of the word heavy. And here they are with their meanings. A heavy person is someone who's well built. Heavy rain, downpours. Heavy movie is a movie that's pretty serious, heavy going, it's a heavy movie. A heavy meal can feel very stodgy, very filling. If you have a heavy workload, you have a lot of work on your plate. If you're a heavy sleeper, you sleep well. If you're a heavy smoker, you smoke a lot, too much. If you have a heavy accent, it's strong and noticeable. So you can see how quickly and simply students can extend their vocabulary by learning some simple words that can be used with heavy. And here's another quick activity. Here's the delexical verb make. So what words collocate frequently with make? I want you to type in and send some of your answers right now. What words collocate with make? Let's see if you can make some good guesses, or if you make a mess of it, or maybe you might make CUP's webinar crash with all the answers that come flooding in. Remember, that's a flash flood, not a quick flood. So let's see what you think are the most frequent words that collocate with words with make. Make up your mind, make noise, make friends, make money. We like that one. Make a difference, that's a great one too. Make a bed. Great. Make do, make a living. You guys have some great ideas. Well, let's see. These are the most common collocations with the verb make. And they are make sure, make sense, make a difference, make a decision, make a mistake, and make money. So you guys did pretty well. You had some of the top collocates there. So what do you need to look for in good teaching materials? You need to look for materials that actively and overtly teach collocations. Don't have materials that leave them hidden in the presentation material. Have material that shows students how to combine words with other words, how to learn them, and that gives examples of the collocations. Get students in the habit of finding out what words are commonly used together. Good materials will teach and present collocations and also have students log these collocations as part of the learning process. And I've given you an example from teaching textbook material here, where the learning tip is about collocations, words that go together. And here it's giving examples of learning adjectives that go before a noun. And this happens to be with food, so we have boiled eggs, fried eggs, and raw eggs. And you'll see in conversation, the most common collocations in conversation with these 6 cooking words are fried chicken, boiled eggs, baked potatoes, grilled cheese, smoked salmon, and raw fish. For those of you where it's late afternoon, you're probably getting hungry and ready for your dinner at this point. And you'll see a little activity here that says cross out the adjective that doesn't go well with each noun. So the material here is overtly teaching students about collocations. It's teaching them which are the most frequently used in a language, and it's giving them activities to help distinguish which words are used frequently together and which are not. It may be a little difficult to see the detail here, but the items presented in bold are commonly used collocations from breaking news. This is from an intermediate level material, so this is for a higher level student. But you'll see the words in bold are frequently used collocations, things like contain an oil spill, or consider legal action, compensate victims, bombs going off, stock market plunging, tensions escalating. All good positive news stuff, right? But the point being, when you look for materials, you want materials that clearly highlight target vocabulary to be learned. So here it's very clear what the collocations are, what the target vocabulary is. In addition to teaching collocations, we also need to teach students vocabulary chunks. This is another useful area of vocabulary and a specialty area of research by my co-author, Professor Michael McCarthy. He's one of my co-authors along with Jean McCartan. Professor McCarthy has done extensive research about chunks, and you can reference his work online. But I'll present a little of it here. If you're not familiar with chunks, a chunk of vocabulary is simply a fixed unit of language. Typically, obviously, it has to be 2 or more words. You can't have a 1-word chunk. And in the top most frequent 1,000 items from the Cambridge International Corpus, more than half of them, more than 50%, are chunks. So here are some facts about chunks. As I mentioned, a fixed unit of language, 2 or more words. Typically, chunks are spoken quickly. And there are different kinds of chunks. And I will give you some examples about the different kinds of chunks. They can be functional, things like catch you later, or greetings, good morning. They can be sentence frames, things like I don't know if. I call these coat hangers. They're kind of expressions on which the rest of a sentence hangs. They can be discourse markers like I mean or you know. Politeness expressions like do you think. Hedging expressions like a little bit, she's a little bit fussy, or kind of, he's kind of mean. Or they can be expressions we use when we want to be vague. Things like that, so on and so forth, and that kind of thing. This is extremely useful vocabulary to teach students, both to improve their writing skills and their speaking skills. So good teaching materials should be teaching these kinds of chunks of vocabulary. And again, it should really be teaching it overtly, so students are aware of it, they know what the expressions mean, they know how to use them in context. So when you're looking for materials, look for activities that present and practice vocabulary of this kind. And again, this list is by no means exhaustive, but it gives you some examples of the kinds of chunks we use in English. Here are some of the top 4 word chunks that we use in spoken American English. And you'll see or something like that, and things like that, and stuff like that. Those are some of the common 4 word chunks that are all for vague expressions. Let's take the expression, I don't know if. And here's an example of material that overtly teaches this chunk, I don't know if. And you'll see that the material clearly explains why we use this expression. I don't know if can introduce a statement, often to involve the other person in the topic. It gives clear examples of how the expression is used in context. For example, I don't know if you know, but you get a free season pass. And it gives the most frequent ways that it's used. And you'll see in the in conversation, some of the most common expressions with I don't know if are, I don't know if you've ever heard, I don't know if you're familiar with, and I don't know if you've ever seen. And then there is a targeted activity that gets students to use I don't know if to introduce topics. Let's look at some other vocabulary that good teaching material should be teaching. As part of the vocabulary of conversation, we need to teach our students response tokens, how to respond to things they hear. It's part of becoming a good listener, an active listener, but students need to know the vocabulary of these response tokens and how to use them. And again, good teaching material should be overtly teaching this kind of vocabulary. And by overtly, I mean not just slipping it into conversation and presentation material. So, here are some of the top single word responses in American English. And you'll see the top single word response is okay, right, really, wow, sure, good, really, great. Okay, so those are some of the top responses in American English. Really is my favorite. I call it, excuse me, I call it the universal response. You can just about use really to respond to anything. So it's a great piece of vocabulary for beginner level students to learn. For example, if I say, it's my birthday today, it actually isn't. My birthday was last week. But if I do and I say, it's my birthday today, of course, it's nice and it's great if your student can say, oh, happy birthday. Are you doing anything special? Are you going out? Or great if they can do that. But if they can't and they still have limited language and they're still at a beginner level, how great if they can respond very simply but very effectively and say, it's my birthday today. Really? Really works just fine. And it's a great booster for students at a beginner level because they can respond appropriately and keep the conversation moving. My husband uses really, my husband is American, by the way. He uses really all the time. He says you can't get into trouble if you respond with really. He has a point. So here's a quick activity for beginner students practicing this very simple response item, really. Have your students come into class with a photo or with an item that is important to them, and have each student give a piece of information and then simply have the class respond, really. It's very simple. It's very fun. Students love it. Let's try it. So, here's my first photo. You all have to respond, really. Are you ready? So, here's where I live in Park City, Utah. Really? By the way, that's not my house. That is a barn in the neighborhood. Next item. I have 2 girls. Really? Okay. They are much older now. My older daughter is 14 and my younger daughter is 10. Everybody respond. Really? Okay, one more. And this is my husband. And this is the point where everybody goes, really? We always have fun with these photos in class. So let's move on. We've looked at ways to tackle the range and depth of student vocabulary and the kinds of things to look for in good teaching materials. But apart from having materials that present a wide range of useful vocabulary, as well as frequently used vocabulary, as well as teaching the depth of vocabulary and all there is to know about a word, and actively practicing it in meaningful ways, we need good materials to encourage students to actively log the words that they learn. It's part of helping students become independent learners, but it's also part of helping students retain vocabulary in the long term. So, what you need good teaching materials to do is show students a variety of ways on how to log new vocabulary. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. Here, students are taught to link new words to existing experiences that they've had. You'll see it says when you learn a new word or expression, link it to something you have recently seen or done. There are good reasons for doing this. In the brain, new information has to be encoded for memory storage. And the brain sends pieces of information to different areas, searching for similarities to previously learned information. And that's how the brain builds up its network. And research shows that the stronger an emotion that is connected to new information, the stronger the memory. So it's very helpful to get students to link new words to existing experiences, especially if they're memorable experiences. A useful way to help students learn vocabulary. Here's another technique. Here students are encouraged to label a map and then draw their own map. It's really important your teaching materials use these kinds of techniques for logging and organizing and learning vocabulary because it helps students remember in their long-term memories. It helps students learn the new information when they visualize it. For some students, that's especially important. So having students draw maps, flowcharts, even this technique that's very simple is very helpful to some students. When students learn a new word, have them write it in the air with their finger. So they write out the word in midair with their finger. It can help them retain the new vocabulary. So you want your materials to incorporate these kinds of techniques for sorting, organizing vocabulary into groups, categories, on maps and charts. And if you don't have time to do these kinds of activities in class, these vocabulary notebook pages are great for students to do out of class. But in any event, it's important students do them. Don't skip over them if you want students to actively improve their vocabulary. Of course, there are other ways to help students retain new vocabulary. We need to recycle vocabulary frequently. As these statistics show, one exposure to a new item of vocabulary leaves very little chance that students will retain it, somewhere between 5 and 14%. The literature has quite a range of arguments about this, but somewhere between 12 and 22 exposures of new vocabulary are needed for long-term retention. Good teaching material should be automatically recycling vocabulary for you. One way to tell if materials are doing that is to look for recycling symbols in the teacher's edition, for example. That will mark where new vocabulary or language is being recycled again. And that can be very helpful for you to know that as a teacher. But as teachers, we have to find opportunities to recycle vocabulary whenever possible. So to finish off today, I'm going to show you a couple of fun activities to help students recycle vocabulary in the classroom. Again, I like to keep activities very simple and very straightforward. Here's an example. So at the start of a new unit, you can always challenge students to use the vocabulary from the previous unit in a warm-up activity. So here you'll see Unit 8 is called At Home, and students are asked in the Before You Begin exercise, what do you keep in these places? Now, in the previous unit, in Unit 7, students learned vocabulary of items to take on a trip. So they learned things like a sleeping bag, scissors, band-aids, all these kind of things. So very quickly, at the beginning of the start of this new unit, you could say to students, talk about the items you have just learned from Unit 7. Where do you keep those things at home? It's a very easy and effective way to recycle. Or at the start of the class, you can have a brain drain game. Give students 1 minute to shout out all the new vocabulary that they learned from the last unit and just write it on the board. So you're overtly recycling the vocabulary that students have just learned. Here's another activity. I should say activity 2, I apologize. I call it the translation game. When I lived in Japan, I was there for 9 years, but I learned most of my Japanese vocabulary from this simple activity. And my roommate, she was from Australia, she was also learning Japanese, and we would play this game constantly. And we learned such a huge range of vocabulary, and it was so much fun. So here's how it works. Student A asks the question, what's the word for? And then insert a word from your native speaker 1 language, okay? So for example, if I was doing this in Japanese, I'd say, what's the word for heisho kyofusho? And then student B has to respond in English, it's, and translate the word. So let me explain that again. Student A would say, what's the word for heisho kyofusho? Student B would say, it's claustrophobia. Claustrophobia is a fear of closed spaces. That was one of the first words I learned in Japanese, having to commute on Japanese subways. I found out if I shouted out heisho kyofusho, everybody would move away and I'd get more space on the subway. Great word to have. So it's a very quick, rapid-fire game that can help students learn new vocabulary, but also recycle vocabulary over and over. You can get students playing this activity at the start of class, at the end of class, out of class, between activities if you have to transition and set something up. It's a quick game that you can set up and play over and over and have fun with. Here's an activity for learning types of music. Students love this one too, beginner level. Student A says, name a rock band, or name a classical musician, name a pop song. So students are inserting their own genre of music there, and student B has to call out the name of the band, a musician, a song. It's a great little activity, again, that can be played very quickly. I'm going to summarize now, and then I will take any questions that you may have. So, what to look for in good teaching material with regard to vocabulary. My co-author, Jeanne McCartan, will be doing a follow-up to this webinar on what to look for in good teaching materials, focusing on grammar in a couple of weeks' time. So watch out for that webinar also. So what to look for vocabulary? Well, does the material or the textbook teach a wide range of vocabulary? Is your material teaching collocations and chunks and response tokens, vocabulary of conversation? I mentioned a few of the areas of useful vocabulary. Again, that wasn't an exhaustive list. But is your material overtly teaching this kind of range of vocabulary? Is your material clearly highlighting the target items? Is your material actively getting students to log and organize vocabulary in meaningful ways? Does the material have a wide range of vocabulary exercises? And does your material or textbook give opportunities to recycle vocabulary? And of course, the final item, which I have neglected to put on the list, is does your material or your textbook overtly show students how to understand the meanings of items of vocabulary, how they're used in context, all there is to know, the depth of vocabulary. I'd like to say thank you so much for taking time to be with me today. I had a great time. I hope you did too. And I'd like to field any questions that you may have.
Thanks very much, Helen. Quite a few questions already. We've got time for a few there. So first of all, from Sylvia Dillon, who asks, what's the best way to do recycling every 2, 3, or 4 units?
Personally, from my own experience, I think it's great to recycle after every 2, 3, or 4 units. But for me personally, I like to recycle after every unit. I like to, especially when it comes with regard to vocabulary. I think it's important to recycle early because that can help with students' retention of vocabulary. If you leave it too late to do the recycling, students will forget, and you'll find yourself having to start over again and reteach the items of vocabulary. So I would say find a couple of minutes at the start of every class to just recycle the vocabulary that you have taught previously. And it's one thing that I have noticed when I've been going around doing presentations, when I've been observing classes. It's one thing that teachers find difficulty for some reason. They find no time to do this in their lessons. And that's why I wanted to show you very simple vocabulary activities, very quick activities, so that you can find time to put them in at the beginning of every lesson. I think it's important.
Okay, thanks. Question now from Katie Fiduli, who asks whether you've got any particular tips for vocabulary working with young learners as young as 5 or 6.
Katie, thank you for your question. I actually, when I was in Japan, I used to teach a group of 5-year-olds who were little budding ballerinas. And it's the challenge with younger learners. However, younger learners have a great receptivity for vocabulary, and they actually can learn quite quickly. One technique is to use mnemonics and to use songs. Young learners love songs, and I used to make up my own little songs for well-known tunes that would insert the vocabulary. So if you can find or make up your own little songs or little rhymes, kids love it.
Well, that sounds great fun. Okay, a question now from Sylvia again, actually, who asks where she can find out more about the sort of different frequencies of words in spoken versus written vocabulary.
Very good question. My co-author, Michael McCarthy, has done a lot of research on this, so you'll find that in some of his papers and work. In our upper levels of Touchstone, the series Viewpoint, in Viewpoint 1 and 2, we do a lot more work on the differences between spoken and written language and spoken and written vocabulary. So if you look at Viewpoint 1 and 2, you will certainly find some explanations in there, and also in the teacher's edition as well.
Okay, thanks. Got a question now from Naira Pogosian, who asks, what vocabulary recycling techniques would you suggest for an ESP class? Naira's particularly thinking of architecture and engineering, but any particular ESP class I think would be useful.
Thank you for the question. Good question. I think any of the activities I've presented to you, they are generic activities. They don't have to be used with the examples that I showed you. They were just examples that I did show you. But you can use any of those activities with ESP classes. There are some textbooks that are also published by Cambridge University Press for vocabulary activities. They are in the teaching series. Look in those books and take any of the generic activities, and you can certainly apply them for ESP classes as well.
Okay, thanks. We've also got a question now from Diana Callisto, who asks whether writing exercises are a good way to recycle the words from a few units.
I think yes. The simple answer is yes. You can certainly use writing exercises. For some students particularly, that is very helpful. Some students don't need to write down items, but I think it's actually very helpful. And one of the techniques I just showed you was to write the words in midair with your index finger. Mm-hmm. I think writing down can actually help in retaining long-term memory. So if you can devise an exercise where students write them down, a simple one that comes to mind is at the beginning of class, give students 30 seconds, and they write down every word that they remember from the last class. Every new item of target vocabulary. Have them write it down, and then they can call it out in groups. Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Helen. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, everyone. But thank you so much for all your contributions, and thank you, Helen, for so many ideas there. It's really useful. Now, don't forget, everyone, that we've got many more webinars coming up. Next week, Chris Redston is back, offering advice on helping students with listening. Then 2 weeks after that, on April the 8th, Chris will be looking at functional language. And then on April the 15th, Jan McCartan will be returning to this subject of what good teaching materials should do, but this time looking at grammar. You can sign up for all those events on our news and events page, which I've just posted into the chat box about a minute ago. So thank you very much, Helen. Thanks, everybody, for contributing too. And we hope you'll join us again for future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you.